This time we're going to talk about queer witchcraft and magic. So, queer witch. The archetype of the witch, in my view, is inherently queer, and the archetype of queerness is inherently witchy. Why do I say that? I'd like to illustrate my point with this quote from Julian Vane, who says, "The potentially transgressive antinomian and outsider qualities of witch are echoed in queer, in that both words have been reclaimed, recuperated and reimagined, not as epithets of denigration, but instead identities of celebration, empowerment, transformation and resistance." So, looking at the etymology of the word queer, it started life meaning strange, peculiar or eccentric, oblique or off-centre, perhaps related to German quer, meaning oblique, perverse, odd, which comes from Old High German tver, also meaning oblique, from a root meaning to twist. The sense of same-sex love was first recorded in 1922, and the noun in this sense is from 1935, derived from the adjective. And the discipline of queer studies started sometime in the mid-90s, around 94. And then we have the verb to queer, meaning to spoil or ruin. And the expression queering the pitch comes from when travelling showmen would attempt to pitch their tent or their spot for performance. And if that failed, it was known as queering the pitch. So let's look at the etymology of the word witch, which is generally a female magician or sorceress, a woman who had dealing with spirits, and to be able to perform supernatural acts, possibly from Old English witcher, a sorcerer or a wizard, or a man who practices witchcraft. From a verb witchian, to practice witchcraft, which is comparable to Low German wicken, to use witchcraft, possibly meaning a soothsayer. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word is of uncertain origin. None of the proposed etymologies of which is free from some phonetic or semantic difficulties. There's also a suggestion that it could be related to vigle, divination, and vig, an idol, and possibly a Proto-Germanic root, vikyaz, a necromancer, from a Proto-Indo-European root meaning vague, to be strong or lively. Now, we often think that the word witch is actually somehow related to the noun wicker, as in willow twigs that have been bent to make baskets. And maybe there is a connection, but if there is, the etymology online site doesn't mention it. But it comes from Swedish vika, to bend, vikja, to move or turn, from a Proto-Indo-European root vik, meaning to bend or to wind. And so these two words may or may not be related. So historically, we can look back to forms of shamanism like Seidra, which was all about the gender bending, and both Seidra men and women were attested in historical times. There was unfortunately a mass drowning of Ergi men who were also Seidra practitioners by a Norwegian king. And there's a rather famous and somewhat grisly engraving of this event. So men who took up magic were said to be ergi, which meant somehow feminine or feminized, and was generally a fairly anti-gay slur at the time. and one of both, I think Loki and Odin both taunted each other with the epithet Ergi. So obviously Loki transformed himself into a mare and gave birth to Odin's horse Sleipnir, and Odin was very keen on getting knowledge, and so he learnt Seidra from Freya, and in the process was said to have become Ergi. This photo on the left of the slide is of a spearmother, or a spay mother, which would be spay wife in English, which is a practitioner of Seidra. And I don't know anything about the origin of this photo. I found it on Tumblr and thought it was a really interesting photo. So nevertheless, the point of all of this is that there were strong links between the practitioners of Seidra and the concept of Ergi in Viking times. So another example of a connection between queerness and witchcraft in the imagination of the medieval period is the example of Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc. Now, we don't know whether Joan of Arc was a queer person. We don't know. We don't think she actually practiced witchcraft. But she's a very interesting character in that she had a female companion. She wore men's clothes mainly for practical reasons. Like she would wear armor when she went into battle, and she would wear she wore men's clothing in prison because she didn't want to get raped, basically. And the wearing of trousers actually provided some protection against that. But in later centuries, she has been seen as a feminist icon, as somebody who stood up and was counted and, made a name for herself. She's been seen as an LGBT plus icon because of the alleged cross-dressing and the possibility that she had a female lover. And she's been seen as a witchy icon because she was accused of witchcraft. And Margaret Murray actually believed that because Joan of Arc had girded on a sword, that meant that she was actually a witch queen, which is a lovely idea. And it's where we get the image of a woman girding on a sword to be the ruler of a circle. So, very interesting character. Probably wasn't a witch. May have been queer. We don't know. But certainly has been cast in all of these lights in later centuries by people who were inspired by her story. And the image we have of her here is by the French gay artists Pierre et Gilles, who do a series of very wonderful pictures of all kinds of interesting people. And they're well worth your time. But anyway, interesting character and somebody who has inspired both witchy and queer iconography. So clearly in the medieval period, there was persecution of both queerness and witchcraft. Here we have a contemporary depiction of Piers Gaveston and Edward II. And the lower image is a 19th century romantic image of Piers Gaveston. And Piers Gaveston was rather well known as the possible lover and certainly the favourite of Edward II, King of England. And in many countries for about 3 centuries during the Middle Ages, later Middle Ages, both queer people and witches were burned at the stake. And this may be where we get the anti-gay slur faggot. not clear, but an exceedingly unpleasant slur if that is the case. But anyway, both queerness and witchcraft were seen as uncanny and preternatural, and some of the people who were accused of witchcraft were also accused of queerness, and vice versa. So there's clearly a connection there. So let's have a look at some queer magical ancestors, people who were both queer and known to be involved in magic or the occult. So I only just found out that Pamela Coleman Smith, known as Pixie, actually lived with another woman for 40 years of her life. Now, they may have been very good friends, but I think generally when you live with someone for 40 years, that probably means that you're romantically involved. And of course, Pamela Coleman Smith is very well known as the artist who produced the wonderful images on the Rider-Waite Tarot, which should be called the Coleman Smith Tarot, obviously. And she was born in Jamaica and came to England, went to England, and she produced these images in the span of about 8 months, which is pretty incredible work. And you can now obtain something called the Melanated Tarot, which is an updating of her images to have black skin, which is very lovely, and I'm sure she would have approved. I also found out in the course of this research for this that she originally may have just done them as line drawings, so it's perfectly valid to colour them in whatever way you want. And I think everyone in the occult world would agree this is a great artistic achievement. And she was also a writer, and she produced lots of other art as well. But of course, this is the art for which she is largely remembered. So yeah, fascinating character, worth a bit more research, I think. Then we have Ithil Colquhoun. Now, I first came across Ithil Colquhoun when I was about 12, I think, when I saw one of her paintings in Southampton Art Gallery, where I grew up. And she's a very interesting woman. She was a member of the Golden Dawn. Is that right? Yes. Yeah, she was a member of the Golden Dawn, and an artist and a writer. And now it's not quite clear what her sexuality was, but she did have a lesbian fling at one point, so I feel justified in including her here. And I think that a lot of her work could be characterized as fairly intensely queer in a theoretical sort of way. So, and there's a wonderful biography of her that's just come out by Amy Hale, which will appear in the further reading page of this presentation. But yeah, very inspiring woman and great occultist and all around interesting character. Then we have Sylvia Townsend Warner, who wrote Lolly Willows or The Loving Huntsman, in which a woman breaks out of her conventional dull lifestyle and runs away to live in the countryside on her own, and ends up becoming a witch and hanging out with basically Satan. And it's a very good book. The first half was a bit boring, to be honest, but I really liked it when she kicked over the traces and became a witch. And Sylvia Townsend Warner was bisexual, and she had an interest in both paganism and witchcraft. So, and she liked cats. So that's good by me. And also had a partner, Valentine Ackland, and I believe they lived together for quite a long time too. So she must read more of her stuff than just this one book. Then we have Edward Carpenter, a lovely painting by Roger Fry. Edward Carpenter was a gay pagan vegetarian socialist. Initially was ordained as a priest in the Church of England. He volunteered to leave that. He had 3 male lovers in his life who he lived with. He and his lover George Merrill actually inspired Maurice by E.M. Forster. And he wrote a lot about the old pagan festivals and how we should go back to paganism. And he this was lambasted by G.K. Chesterton, of all people. And one of the really interesting things about Edward Carpenter, as well as his being gay and pagan, is that he was a socialist and one of the co-founders of the modern labour movement. And there seems to have been quite a strong connection between the left and pagan views at this time. And indeed, Sylvia Townsend Warner, who was on the previous slide, was also a convinced anti-fascist and wrote against fascism as well. So clearly a left-wing person as well. And I've always loved this quote from Edward Carpenter here. The meaning of the old religions will come back to him. On the high tops, once more gathering, he will celebrate with naked dances the glory of the human form and the great processions of the stars, or greet the bright horn of the young moon. And that's from Civilization, Its Cause and Cure. And some of Carpenter's poetry is very beautiful. There is a Edward Carpenter Society which I believe is based in Sheffield, where he lived for a long time, and very interesting character. So it should be honoured as one of the founders of the modern pagan movement. Then we have Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson, also painted by Roger Fry here. Lowes Dickinson was a gay pagan writer and humanist. It was his idea to found the League of Nations, which was the forerunner of the United Nations. And he's chiefly remembered for his writings on pacifism and internationalism. But he was also lambasted by G.K. Chesterton, which is where I found out about him, for being a pagan. And he was very interested in classical Greece and the fact that obviously being gay would not have been a problem in classical Greece. So there's a strong connection between people who were gay being interested in classical Greece, because they knew full well that the ancient Greeks didn't have a problem with gayness. They were weird about all kinds of other stuff, but they didn't have a problem with gayness. So that was one of the reasons why the pagan revival got going. So thank you, Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson and Edward Carpenter, and they were of course friends. And they both knew E.M. Forster. So some interesting connections here. Okay, so let's have a look at some contemporary manifestations of queer magic, and got a couple of book recommendations here. Queer Magic, Power Beyond Boundaries, which was edited by Lee Harrington and Ty Phoenix Callistin. It's an excellent anthology of a lot of really excellent writing. And then we have Queer Magic, LGBT plus Spirituality and Culture from Around the World, which is by Thomas Prower. And I haven't read this one yet, but people who have say it's very good and really need to get hold of a copy. So let's have a look at some contemporary queer magical ideas. So from the book Queer Magic by Lee Harrington and Ty Felix Callistin, here it is. There you go. We have this idea of the Queer Wheel of the Year by Steve Kenson. And he talks about how each of the festivals can have a queer meaning, and it starts at Yule when you start to awaken, so you start to realize who you are and about your sexuality and the nature of who you are. And then at Imbolc, it's about naming what you are, so becoming fully realized as an identity. And then once you've named what you are, you're then able to come out, and that happens at Eostre. And then at Beltane, you have the realization of the ecstasy of the joy of your sexuality. And then at Midsummer, traditionally Pride season, you then have the fullness of being proud of who you are. And then at Lammas, you come together with other queer people to form family and community. At Autumn Equinox, we then move on to the idea of mentorship, where older queer people can be mentors to younger queer people. And this is something that he points out is sadly lacking in both in our culture as a whole and in the queer community, because so many people were lost to AIDS who would be in this mentor phase. And I am old enough and lucky enough that when I was in my late teens, I met a queer household that was being mentored by an older gay man. And it was really beautiful to see that he was able to provide a sort of alternate family to that group of people. And I learned a lot from that guy, and I really bless him for that community that he created. It was very lovely. And then moving into Samhain, the concept of elderhood and how older queer people can become the repository of stories of the past and the wisdom that they can share. And of course, that's when we would think about queer ancestors, and it's one reason why the transgender rite of elevation is around Samhain, because Samhain is associated with ancestors. If you're not familiar with the transgender rite of elevation, there's a wonderful account of it also in Queer Magic, and it's a very good ritual where transgender people who have died or have been killed can be elevated to be ancestors, and very important spiritual work being done there. So highly recommend that. And you can look at the website. I think it's Transrite on Tumblr, and that's all organised by Alder Knight. So excellent piece of work. But yeah, I really wanted to share this Queer Wheel of the Year because I think it's an excellent idea. It's something that I plan to be exploring, and find it very, very helpful. So do check it out. Another important concept in queer spirituality generally is the 10 queer spiritual roles identified by Christian de la Huerta. Now, he talks about the idea of queer people as catalytic transformers, quite often at the forefront of social movements for liberation. Outsiders, mostly by force, because by being forced to the margins, it makes you really take a long, hard look at society and what's really happening. Quite often, consciousness scouts, again, pioneers in many fields, both literary, scientific, and so on. The idea of the sacred clown and the internal youth, that sort of joyful, queer creativity that you can often experience. Keepers of beauty. It's no accident that the artistic and musical fields and literary fields are chock full of LGBT people. We're quite often caregivers, people who, care for people, especially those who are marginalised. We're often seen as mediators, the in-between people. So the idea of at some point, queer people were actually known as intermediates. So it's this idea that as a person who is neither male nor female, that means that you have access to in-between spiritual states. So therefore it's easier to be a shaman and travel to other worlds. Which brings us neatly to the next point, which is shamans and priests, sacred functionaries. I think it's Thich Nhat Hanh who writes about the idea that the ultimate goal of the spiritual journey is actually to become androgynous and to incorporate the qualities of both male and female. So that gives queer people an edge when trying to develop spiritually. And also important idea, the divine androgyne, which is important in a number of different traditions. Again, as that spiritual goal of the spiritual journey is being the divine androgyne. And because of that intermediate role, the queer people are often seen in many cultures as gatekeepers who keep the gate open to the other world because of having one foot in each world. So this 10 Queer Spiritual Roles by Christian de la Huerta is a book that you can get. It's available on Amazon. And some very helpful ideas in this list. So for the reading, if you're interested in Seidra and Ergi, then I highly recommend 9 Worlds of Seidh Magic by Jenny Blaine. If you want to look at the concepts of gender and sexuality generally in magical practice, then I would heartily recommend Outside the Charmed Circle by Misha Maudlin. I've just finished it and it's really, really good. Ithel Colquhoun, Genius of the Fern-Loved Gully by Amy Hale. Must get hold of a copy because I've been interested in Ithel Colquhoun for ages and can't wait to read Amy's book. My very own All Acts of Love and Pleasure, inclusive Wicca, and further exploration of the ideas in All Acts of Love and Pleasure you can find in Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, and The Night Journey, Witchcraft as Transformation. And I heartily recommend Queer Paganism, A Spirituality That Embraces All Identities by Joe Green, and Casting a Queer Circle, Non-Binary Witchcraft by Thistam and I. Some of the other material I found useful. The blog of Baphomet, particularly their queer tag category. My own Dowsing for Divinity. I have a queer tag which can lead you on to more books and articles about queer magic, and the very lovely Major Arquina. So check all those out. Do check out my other videos. I've got quite a few now. I've got witchy books, a review of tarot decks, the Two Chalices ritual. Then I've got a whole series on potted history of witchcraft, key ideas in paganism, recovering from fundamentalism, cultural appropriation, some Wiccan basics, queer spirituality, inclusive Wicca. So check out my channel. Don't forget to hit subscribe. You know you want to. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation. So tune in next week for more. Bye.